Hello. So, today I wanted to talk about a subject that I've been delaying talking about for a very long time. Um, it is a very difficult subject to present and integrate ideas or synthesize them across different concepts on the matter, but I think it's ready. So I want to discuss evil and specifically political systems and atrocities that happen within those, and if we can identify those specific elements of those uh, evil systems, and how we can identify or prevent looking at those in the future. So I'm gonna start with atrocities, and I'm gonna run some numbers now because people may, how can I say, query what I'm going to be presenting. So I'd just like to start with some dry facts and move on to the more conceptual idea following that. So, which political systems in history committed the greatest atrocities? So, we're starting with the Soviet Union. Estimated between 20 and 60 million people died. Within those, a lot of people were sent to the gulags, which were particularly horrific. There was the Great Purge, which was mainly Stalin's way of getting rid of people who opposed him or interfered with the Communist Party's ideas, or just slightly cosmopolitan or bourgeoisie. This includes the Soviet famines. This particular affects, it's between 31 and 33, particularly affects the Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And I'll just pause for a second and emphasize a few points. There's two schools of thoughts as to what happened here. And the question here is, was this done in a malicious way, or was this done by accident? So basically what happened was that if you go with the first school of thought, then there was a certain farmers in mainly in the Ukraine, that decided that they are not interested in doing collectivized farming, which was something that Stalin was looking to do. They wanted to have their individual kind of plots of land and work that way, and Stalin and some of his henchmen were upset at this, so they started a process of dekulakization, where they took these people who used to be peasants but were either given a plot of land at some point and they did very well for themselves in terms of producing food, and the Stalin took these people and put them in Siberian gulags, or in a more malicious way, they came into towns and took all the bushels of wheat and sent it to parts of the Soviet Union that were focusing on, to the cities basically, but parts of the Soviet Union that were focused on industrialization. And as a result of these either very high quotas or forcibly taking every food and tool and animal in the house, people starved, and there was a great deal of cannibalization as well. The other direction that this could go is that collectivized farming was a main culprit in the low yield of the now farms that had to collectivize. Though in addition there was a drought, and possibly there was also bad directives as to how to plant seeds in the ground. But as a result, and as a result of very high quotas for grains, people starved. And Stalin didn't, in the second way, Stalin did not intend this, and at some point reduced the quotas and even sent some grains back, but it was too late. So these are either two ways of looking at it. one malicious, one by accident, but those are currently the historic way of looking at it. The historic way would say that it's not malicious, and people in the Ukraine and Kazakhstan that have museums, and there are still some people who are alive, and if you look at it from a more like a court case kind of way, then they would say that it was intentional, or there was no other possibility if you take away every person's food. So it's a sort of man-made famine. But continuing on from that, there was the invasion of Poland, which caused the death of some people. And the Russians or the Soviets did, I'm not sure slaughter is the right word, but they did like purge a lot of ethnic minorities that were either disruptive or they just didn't like or didn't fit the mold that we're looking for. And there was also World War II, although I don't think World War II is included in these figures. I just added it myself because it was known that Stalin was particularly cruel with regards to just sending bodies onto the progressing German army and just didn't care if they lived or died, and this caused a great deal of death, but it's not included in the figure, I believe. Let's move to Nazi Germany, that caused the deaths of 17 million people. Within those, Jews, 6 million of those died, which was particularly heinous because it was the third of the global population of all Jews, so it's very much an attempted genocide. But in addition to Jews, gypsies and disabled people also ended up in concentration camps and died. Russians that the invading German army that invaded into Russia died as a result of the war, but I do believe that is included in the figures. And also when Germany invaded Poland as well. So Poland suffered twice, both from the Soviets and the Nazis. China, so 60 to 80 million people died, based on a report from two Chinese scholars that fled the country. A lot of it, or most of it, is from the Great Leap Forward, which was again an attempt to collectivize the farms. This was some decades after the Russians attempted to do this, and had worse results. It is estimated around between 30 and 55 million people died, depending who you ask, around these times. Again, collectivized farming, planting it wrong. I didn't mention earlier, but there's a lack of incentives for people to work hard because they were getting food anyway. And there was also an issue with destroying or trying to kill sparrows, which caused like sort of a large number of locusts that ate the grain. Basically, similar results. A lot of people starved, a lot of people died. But in this particular case, it was particularly heinous because the people in the political party kind of turned a blind eye to what was going on, or they were afraid from Mao Zedong will do something to them, or that the plan isn't working, so they kept it going, including officials that were living in the actual towns that were implementing this. Everyone was just very afraid to mention anything, so they just continued with it and caused more of a more negative result. The Cultural Revolution is a similar approach of enemies of the state or people who are like slightly cosmopolitan, similar to what the Soviets did. That was the invasion of Tibet and the killing of the people there, which was I think around 1.2 million people. And moving on to Cambodia, which is the last one. Cambodia killed between 1.7 and 2.5 million, but out of a population of 7 million people. What they were trying to do is have like an agrarian socialist republic, similar to the collectivized farming that the other communist countries were trying to. It was very important for Cambodia to be independent from the previous status of French colonized areas, and to them, like, the independent peasantry was like the ideal. That's what everyone should strive for. So what they did was they basically killed viciously anyone that didn't fit that mold. If you're intelligent, if you're academic, if you even wear glasses, you would get half the food rations, and then slowly you were outright killed. And not only you were killed, but your wife and your children would be killed. The children would be smashed against the tree. It was horrific, and basically carried out by young peasants who were, I don't know, brainwashed by the leadership, and they just carried out these extremely heinous acts. But within that figure, there was also a great number of, sorry, not a great number, but the percentage of Muslim Cambodians that died was very high. So there was again like a sort of class-based component to the killings, and also a race-based component to the killings. Okay, so let's try to do a comparison between these systems and see if there are similar similar elements. So before, as these systems were getting up and running, it's important to kind of understand what these systems, these political systems, represent to the people in the country. And essentially, it was something that was bigger than you. Like, it was this ideal, perhaps utopian, where if we all band together, we could improve around this concept of either communism or something, or fascism. That if we all band together, we can achieve this ideal that is external to us, and it would all help us. If sacrifices needed to be made, and that's okay, because ultimately the end vision is more important than a few sacrifices along the way. Or as the New York Times reporter that was stationed in Moscow used to say, you cannot make an omelet without breaking some eggs. And there was a dependence on the individuals who were in that system, because in a sense, like, if the system does well, or the better that it does, the better you do as a result of the system improving, and the freer you are. Or in a sense, like, the better the system, again, the better the system does, the more resources can get distributed to you, the more freedoms you have. You and everyone else in the system benefits. Let's discuss a bit about the ideology that these systems hold in a similar way. So first, it has to very much be an egoless system. Like, people cannot be individual, they can't think of themselves, you have to think of the group. And I just wanted to read a small quote, if you let me. Okay. It is thus necessary that the individual should finally come to realize that his own ego is of no importance in comparison with the existence of his nation, that the position of the individual ego is conditioned solely by the interest of the nation as a whole, that above all, the unity of the nation's spirit and will are worth far more than the freedoms of the spirit and will of the individual. The state of mind which subordinates the interest of the ego to the conservation of the community is really the first premise for every truly human culture. The basic attitude from which such activity arises, we call, to distinguish it from egoism and selfishness, idealism. But this we understand only the individual's capacity to make sacrifices for the community, for his fellow men. So this is a quote from Adolf Hitler, to kind of like bring home that how important that these kind of systems subordinate the individual to the collective in a sense. And within these ideologies, there's a very much sense of an us versus them. It can be like the us can be like a sort of collective versus them, like a different collective, but there has to be this sort of conflict where there's like a sort of internal threat, in a sense where or like most of us are trying to achieve the system, but some of us are trying to sabotage it. So in the case of the communist or socialist, it's us, the proletariat or the peasantry, versus the bourgeoisie or the capitalist class. They're trying to take away from us, destroy us, make us suffer. And similar in Nazi Germany, it's the Germans, the Aryan nation, the pure, so on and so forth, versus the Jews that are internally sabotaging things. They hold all the money, they hold all the media, and it's their fault that we lost the First World War anyway. And it's sort of like an internal threat which causes like a lot of frustration and anxiety, but it's difficult to point exactly to what it is, because it's a group within a group. So it's not like an object that you can focus on. It's like a thing that you can't really you kind of can identify it when you see it, but it's like a vague thing or a vague concept that is eating at your ability to succeed in a way. This group also oppresses us. In the case of the capitalist class, for example, it oppresses the proletariat and the peasantry outright. And this sort of thing like has like a sort of tribalism, like in a sense also like a primitive tribalism. Like it makes you angry, it makes you more, reverts you to a more primitive state in a way, or at least that's how I see it. So yeah, we talked, I guess I read ahead. We have anger, frustration, and yeah, sort of like disabling of reason and turning on of emotions. Politically, these systems have a few things in common. A lot of them essentially have concentrated power. So you have concentrated political power. There's typically only one party. There's not like a pluralism in terms of parties with different ideologies. It's just one. Oh, skipping ahead, reading ahead again. These, apart from having political power, they typically also have power over the economy. In the case of communism and socialism, it's basically, or socialism, let's say, it's full control of all the economy, the factories, the distribution of resources. In the case of fascism, it's you still had private property, but it was you had no control over it, or in a sense, the factory owners legally were the owners, but they were told by the state what to make, how much to make, what to sell it for, when to deliver it, who they hire in terms of minorities they didn't want to hire, what kind of music they had to play in the offices, or what kind of announcement. So basically, it's essentially the same but slightly different. But they still, the political party had the great control over the economy, and typically they also had social control. I think the fascists were a bit more on this kind of area, but still, even in China, people had to read Mao's Little Red Book, and there was a great deal of social control there as well. But as you can see, it's a form of concentrated power. And also, there was a hierarchy in all of these systems. You had the sort of godlike leader. You had the party and officials within the party spread across the country. And then you had the rest, which were the masses. And essentially the system itself was against the individual. So the more against each individual it is, the more like collective it is. But it also means that there were no individual freedoms in a sense. There were no free speech. you would punish political, sorry, not you, but the party would punish political dissent. And essentially it was illiberal, but by definition all these systems are illiberal, even at their core ideologies. Okay, moving on to psychology of these systems. Now this gets a bit more complicated, so I'm going to try how to explain myself. There was a psychologist or social psychologist called Le Bon, who in the late 19th century came up with a theory of the psychology of crowds. And the idea of the crowds is, I don't think I'll explain well, but I do have a clip that will from a different channel, which I'll link in the description, that explains a little bit better. But the idea is that while people are within these crowds, they are less individualistic, and they form or join a sort of crowd, especially like a more like emotional or violent crowd, but also a more politically connected crowd as well, even though they're not physically standing to one another. And I'll just quickly play the clip and hope that will explain it.
When an individual becomes part of a crowd, according to Le Bon, he undergoes a profound psychological transformation. That is, he ceases to operate as an individual. He is no longer himself, but has become an automaton who has ceased to be guided by his will. With such a psychological transformation, an individual no longer lives for himself, but instead becomes a pawn who sacrifices his own personal ends and goals in favor of those of the crowd. In a crowd, every sentiment and act is contagious, and contagious to such a degree that an individual readily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest.
Okay, let's continue. Another element of psychology is the chosen people. So Karl Popper, who is a major figure in philosophy of science, or what is valid science, what counts as science, kind of went through historicism, which is kind of what Marxism is. The fundamental ideas from Marxism is historic materialism, but in a sense historicism. And he said that it is difficult you can't predict patterns in history in this way, and in a sense they're unfalsifiable. If you say that, look, there's a group of people in history, they were like this, and then they change into this, and in the future they're going to change to something else. There's no way to falsify that or disprove it, or like elements of it you can say these are wrong but these are right. It's just pseudoscientific in a way. And not only is it pseudoscientific, it is a prophecy. So this is very meaningful to a lot of people, where, you know, my group has been oppressed for many thousands of years or hundreds of years, and soon, because of the way that the motions of history move, and we can and this kind of historicism predicts that, then we will rise to power and gain power, and we don't have to do anything at all, because it's already determined in advance, and this prophecy will be fulfilled. And the idea is behind that everything is ever changing, nothing stands still, or everything is a process, or in the process of change. And because of that, if we predict these kind of flows of change, we can say that in the future this group will rise to power. It is an argument all the way from ancient Greece, between Heraclitus, that was for ever change, and Parmenides, who says no, some things stay the same. It is a long conversation, but I would add that a lot of people still today think that, you know, politics and economics will ever change, and at some point we will still try socialism and communism again. But the problem is that things like facts and reason are things like facts and reason are they're kind of static in a way. Like if you look at a fact, this is a fact, and it's going to stay that way. If this is a rock or this is a table, it's going to stay that way. It may change its form like in the future, but it's certainly not the case that you can expect everything to be different in the future and that you can predict. Well, I'm not explaining this well, but you can. It certainly is the case that some things are permanent, especially if we look at them, and the approach that things are always changing and to focus on how that change happens is a sort of pseudo-scientific endeavor, because you can't predict what will happen in the future. Anyway, I do recommend people to read Karl Popper's The Poverty of Historicism or Karl Popper's Open Society, where he discusses that further. These, and this is a very important part here, these systems have a sort of anti-reason or a very strong anti-reason element to them. We already discussed how emotionalism kind of switches off your rationality and you act in a more primitive state. And this is like a core tenet of it, but it is not the case that you completely destroy reason and you're against reason, because you still need reason. So what to function and do things in society and work and things that still needs reason. That still needs to see how reality actually functions. But the idea of these systems is to make reason impotent, or in a sense that you can use reason for your job and planting a seed in the ground and putting water in it and expecting it to grow. But the important things like morals or political decisions, reason is impotent in those areas. So it is kind of a way to make to kind of like poison reason or make reason less or limit it in a way that it's very compartmentalized to something specific, but the more important, like long-term things, ideas, that it has no effect on those things. A lot of these political systems had a sort of half-truth where you would very narrowly look at a part of reality and use reason for that, but the rest of it, you would ignore the rest of the complete picture, and you would form these sort of conceptual systems in your head where the rest is filled with like emotionalism and stuff. So for example, if like you will say the relationship between a worker and his employer is exploitative because you narrowly look at what the employer earns. So if, for example, the standard argument is you would have an employee, you would hire them, but you would have like, let's say 10 or 20% or 30% of the value you would keep for the employer would keep for themselves, therefore you're exploiting the employee. But if you look at the wider picture, just in this, there's even a wider picture, but just in this sense, you would say, well, the employee is also earning, I don't know, 20 or 30% from than a different employer, or 20 or 30% than not working at all. And while both parties in this kind of transaction benefit to some degree, and they both enter it voluntarily, then no exploitation actually occurs. But if you narrowly look at just one side of this equation, of this transaction, then you say, well, this is exploitation, and the system is and you kind of like develop a sort of system based on a narrow view of reality and emotions, essentially, or subjectivity. And to a lot of degrees, there is a sort of, and this is really what the true evil comes in, you can evade actual reality. So you are outright, you know reality exists more than what you're narrowly focusing on. There are other parts of it, but you on purpose ignore it. And a good example of this is the Auschwitz prison guard. So there would be interviews of prison guards after the war. He says, what were you doing? They said, I was just doing my job. I wasn't I was just following orders. Did you know what was happening behind you? No, not really. So any prison guard could have, like investigated a bit further what was happening, but they chose to evade it. They chose to ignore reality, and this kind of let me see if there's just a bit forward. No, this kind of thing led to basically a lot of evil to happen by people above them. Like there was the book that Hannah Arendt wrote about the banality of evil, which I also recommend reading. That the people who committed these really evil atrocities, they were just mindlessly following orders without thinking. They were very average people, and this evasion of reality is a very core element of committing these evil atrocities, where no one questions anything, where everyone just does what they're told. So this anti-reason approach is a very important part of it. So let's just summarize what the elements of evil are. There's the us versus them approach, a sort of conflict or ongoing conflict between two groups, and they are a threat, they are upsetting, they are ruining everything, they are oppressing us. We need to do something about it. There's the anti-reason elements that we discussed, and there is the anti-individual approach to a lot of the politics, and that summarizes this presentation. This was a very, very, very high level, scratching the surface presentation. I very much recommend you look further at these topics. Hopefully I've given you some kind of way to connect some of the concepts. And before I leave, we'll end it with a video from Karl Popper talking about what kind of societies, or what type of societies he was looking for in the future. Thank you very much.
Wie Sie sagen, es heißt die offene Gesellschaft und ihre Feinde. Die Feinde sind hauptsächlich die Faschisten, die Nazis und aber auch die kommunistische Diktatur, obzwar die kommunistische Diktatur ja damals mit uns verbündet war. Und was ich bei der offenen Gesellschaft gemeint habe, war eine Gesellschaft, sagen wir, in der man frei atmen kann, frei denken kann, in der jeder Mensch einen Wert hat.